Okay, this was not supposed to happen. The local police car was trying to catch up with this boy's speeding Triumph Spitfire, and he's chasing him along through the streets, and then he gets to the family compound, and the security gates are closing, and the boy gets his Spitfire in just in time, but before the police car that's following him can get there, the gates close. Now the policeman is left just outside of these gates. The kid goes on up to the house, he peels in, he runs up to his room, and he's just kind of riding the thrill of adrenaline here. But pretty soon, the booming voice of his father calls him down and says, "Son, I'm letting the policeman who's at the gates up to the house, and I want you to know that if he wants to arrest you, he has my support." Now that comes from the teenage years of Franklin Graham, son of Billy Graham. Here's another one. He'd been drinking yet again, but as he had done before, he stepped behind the wheel of a car. That was nothing new. But this time he had taken along his 16-year-old brother. And when he got home, he had gone through town first, I should tell you. He like hit a garbage can and dragged it noisily through town. So everybody knew about this. He goes on home. His father is furious with him, not only because he had endangered his life yet again, but this time he'd had the audacity to put his younger brother's life in danger. And so he's taking it up with his son, and his son, feeling clearly the continued effects of alcohol, says, "Well, why don't you step outside and we will settle this man to man." That comes from the years of a young man known as George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States. Here's another one. Her pastor father never argued when she got like this, and he was very calm even in the face of such ugly, venomous, anti-God attacks in his own home. But her mother just became unglued, and the screaming match that would go on between them could have been heard by anybody who managed to be within a block of the parsonage, most likely. But in the end, this child went off to a state university, joined the American Atheist Association, and lived a life free of the rules and constraints of her childhood. And those come from the wayward years of my own life. Now, in the examples that I've just given, we may be thinking we're talking about just kids who are going through a rebellious period or something like that. But I know that sometimes the issues are much, much more grave. Sometimes these kids are getting into issues that are so serious that can include alcohol and violence and drugs and jail time and multiple pregnancies and multiple abortions and serious crimes. And there's just this huge list these days of extremely risky, self-destructive behavior that we can find these kids getting into. And it can squeeze a parent's heart to the breaking point. Well, God has been nudging me to give this talk for many, many years. And I put it off for a very long, long time. I really did not want to start talking about this. And in truth, partially it's because I'm embarrassed of it. I would rather that you thought I'd always been in the church, that I had never been a profound embarrassment to my parents, that I had never left the path that God originally had planned for me, that I'd always been faithful. And I can pull that off pretty well. I'm pretty steeped in church culture. I speak church speak, And so if my pastor says, turn to Zechariah, I know where to go. If he says turn to Jude, I still know where to go. If he says turn to Second Hesitations, I know to leave my Bible closed. I know the old hymns. I can walk and talk and sound like I have always been on the path. But if I allow you to persist with that belief, it would be a deception, which is another word for a lie. And the reason that I began to share it was I realized too many people are out there thinking they're the only ones going through this. They think there's no one else in the pews anywhere else who would understand what's going on in their home. And I know that there are children out there like me. Now, they may just be going through a period where, like me, they begin by having doubts about God's existence and questions about God. And you need to know there's a huge risk for us kids in sharing those feelings. Because just in sharing them, there's this sudden gulf between us and other believers. And it's a very, very risky time. So people who've never had such doubts tend not to know what to do with those of us who have them. And I know when I was a child, just having those questions, it was seen as a sin. When in truth, you know what I was doing? I was doing what I now call spiritual tire kicking. I wanted to make this faith my own, and I just needed the worldview to make sense. But suddenly, by asking those questions, I was now disenfranchised from a community that I loved, and I learned to be quiet. So one of the things I think parents all through the church need to know is there is no question their child can bring to them that's going to unravel this God thing. It's not going to happen. There's nothing they can bring to you that is so big that God can't handle it. And we need to own that right up front. If we don't have the answer, that's okay, but there is an answer, and we can find it. So as I said, I put off this talk for a very long time. And one day, one of the sweetest women in my church, Beth, she even has a sweet name, Beth Beth comes up to me and she says, we would like you to speak at this upcoming ladies' brunch. And I thought, well, that's great. I've spoken there before. And so I start kind of rifling through my various talks and thinking which one they want me to do, one on motherhood or one on faithful discipleship or whatever, one on Titus women, I don't know. And she said, no, not this time. This time we want you to speak about your years as an atheist, how you went through that walk and what brought you back. And I thought, oh, man. Now, not only is God nudging me, he set a date, So I thought, all right, I've got to go with this. And the way I came away from it is I really felt God saying to me, it's not enough to just accept my grace and be quiet about it. So I began to speak and began to share my story. Now, I'm thinking right off the bat, you might want to have some pause about my theology, because here I am, I say no to God for years, and I say yes to Beth right away. I'm pretty sure there's a heresy in there somewhere, but you can decide. So like I say, I was raised in the church. My father was a pastor. It is really important to me that you know that he was in no way the cause of my doubts. Now, I know a lot of people come and hear me speak, and they think they're going to hear some sordid detail about the difficult home I had. I don't have one to share. The wonderful thing about my father, he was this brilliant, godly, humble man. I mean, I think that's the richest combination you can get in a believer. That's what I had. And everything I heard from the pulpit is what I saw in his life every day. There were no two sides to this man's walk. And I had that as my very, very rich heritage. For me, the original doubts were steeped in theological questions. Now, originally I had the childhood of faith, a faith childhood that I would expect all children would have. And I call it a coattail faith, where I am basically riding on the coattails of my parents. So they were Christian, I was Christian. If they had come home one day and said, you know what, we're not going to be Christian anymore today, we're going to be Buddhist, I'd have gone, okay, where are we going to church now? It's just that one of those things I would have followed along. But when I began to mature, and I began to make my faith my own, and I had questions that started to arise, this is a point where instead of being distanced from our children, we should be celebrating, because they're saying, I want this Jesus thing to be mine. I want to own it. I want to feel it. I want to get it. I want it to make sense. And that should be a time, it's a fragile time, don't get me wrong, but it should be a time of celebration, because they're coming to you with the real longing for Jesus on their heart. So anyway, I did go off to a Christian college for my freshman year, where my doubts continued. I was really plagued by them. I did not want to lose my faith. The Christian community was all I had ever known, and I loved it there. I was not unhappy there. But so I'm here, at this Christian college, and I had some worldview questions, and so I don't know that I was a typical rebellion that you think of as a prodigal for those days. I think I'm more typical today, but for then it was kind of unusual. But I decided, I wanted to find out about what these professors thought about these questions. So I began setting appointments with all of my professors, and I was a little intense. I will admit that. I think I made them nervous, and I think after a while I made them sigh a lot. But, because it was a very tumultuous time for me. So I didn't couch my questions in lovely kind of, diplomatic terms. I would come in there going, how can the proof of the Bible be the Bible itself? That makes no sense. That is circular reasoning. We would not accept that reasoning in any other arena. Why do we accept it here? If I'm allowed to say, why is this book true? It's true because it says it's true. Well, then I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a book that says, Carol is God, give her all your money. Why is it true? Because it says it's true. You can't do that. That is not legitimate. And I knew that. Another one of my questions is, how can the Christian faith be more valid than any other faith? What is that about? I knew of adherents to other faiths who were very devout, perhaps more devoted than some of the Christians that I knew. So how is it that we summarily just dismiss all of them? What is that about? And I wanted to know the answer to that. And I wanted to know, how can a loving God send anyone to hell? That's a pretty standard question, but it was new to me. And how could that be? That seems to be such an evil dynamic. In fact, why isn't God an egotist? I don't get that. He creates beings, their sole purpose is to please him, and if they don't do it right, then zap, off to Fry City. Explain this to me. Okay, now, you can understand why they began to cross to the other side of the street when they saw me coming. I understand that now. I know that it was a little intense. But what was interesting to me is how often they didn't have the answers to those questions. And it wasn't for a bad reason. It's that they had gone from that coattail faith to a faith of their own without that spike of questioning that I had had. And that's a lovely thing for them. But it did make them ill-prepared to answer the questions that kids like me had. That's the only thing that was difficult about it. But for them and their faith, it was a lovely thing. So at one point, one of the professors said to me, well, maybe you don't belong here. Maybe you would be happier in a state school. And I'd sort of been thinking that might be a possibility too. So at that point, I agreed, and off I went to a state school. Now here you might be thinking, okay, now she's going to just plunge into a world of partying and riotous living and so on. No, I still was seeking God. I had decided at that point he was no longer to be found in the traditional Orthodox Protestant faith, but I was still looking for him. So I began to visit every religion I could find and spent some time, in their company and taking a look at what their various beliefs were. And eventually, they have to lay out for you, here are the premises on which our belief system is built. And one by one, I would rule out a premise saying, that's not, that doesn't work, that can't hold up to scrutiny. So one by one, I just kind of ruled them all out. And so then where does a secular person go for their religion at this point? Well, I began to go into philosophy. And spent a lot of time, enjoyed philosophy a lot. At that point I was loving it, reading about Hegel and Kierkegaard and Kant and Nietzsche. And I think that at one point with my more youthful brain, not today, I might have been able to listen to Ravi Zacharias the first time through and understood him. But I must tell you now, I'm so thankful for the replay button because, man, I have to hear him like 4 or 5 times to get everything he has to say. Love him. But anyway, so at one point I really enjoyed philosophy. I really thought that was something that I wanted to perhaps major in. Really liked it. Never could quite bring myself to major in it. Didn't know why at the time. Years later, discovered a quote by G.K. Chesterton that just worked for me. I thought that was it. That was my reasoning for not majoring in it. G.K. Chesterton once said he too considered making philosophy his life area of study, but somehow happiness just kept breaking through. And I thought about that. That's really kind of what it was. I really wasn't designed to live with all of the misery and self-loathing that seems to go along in a lot of philosophical circles. And sometimes it's misery and everybody else loathing that goes on in those circles. And I wasn't really predisposed toward either of those. So in the end, I was left an atheist. And I did at that point indeed jump into a world without constraint.